Perfection doesn't feel like ambition. It feels like pressure that never releases. You tell yourself you're just trying to improve, that you have high standards, that you don't want to settle. But underneath that story, something else is happening. You never arrive. No matter what you accomplish, the relief is brief, a moment at best. Then the bar moves, higher, farther, out of reach again. You don't celebrate, you audit. You don't feel proud, you feel exposed, as if anything less than flawless would reveal something unacceptable about you. Perfectionism isn't about excellence, it's about control. Control over judgment, control over rejection, control over the fear that if you stop refining yourself, someone will finally see what you're trying to hide. That's why enough never lands, because enough would mean stopping, and stopping would mean standing still without armor. So you keep improving, refining, correcting. You mistake exhaustion for discipline. You call self-criticism honesty. You convince yourself that once you fix the next flaw, then you'll rest. But rest never comes. Only another standard, another comparison, another reason you're still not there yet. Perfection promises safety. It tells you, if you get this right, nothing can touch you. But it lies, because the closer you get, the more fragile you feel. One mistake feels catastrophic. One slip feels like exposure. So you tighten further. Perfection doesn't make you confident. It makes you vigilant, always scanning for what's wrong, always measuring yourself against an invisible ideal that no one else can even see. And the cruelest part? From the outside, it looks like success. People praise your work ethic, your discipline, your standards. They don't see the cost. They don't see how much of your life is spent chasing a feeling that never arrives, the feeling of finally being allowed to relax. If you've ever felt like you're doing everything right and still feel behind, if better has become a moving target that keeps you running but never satisfied, stay. Subscribe to Soulless. This channel exists for the moments when you realize the thing driving you forward might be the very thing keeping you empty. Why perfectionism is fear wearing discipline's face. Perfectionism doesn't announce itself as fear. If it did, you would confront it. It arrives disguised as responsibility, as pride, as just wanting to do things right. You don't feel afraid. You feel alert, always watching, always correcting, always one step ahead of exposure. That vigilance feels productive. It feels mature. But vigilance is not growth. It's defense. Another layer deepens. Perfectionism is not driven by love for excellence. It's driven by terror of being seen as insufficient. That fear is quiet. So quiet, you mistake it for motivation. You don't wake up thinking, "I'm afraid." You wake up thinking, "I can't afford to mess this up." That sentence runs everything. Another layer sharpens. You don't aim high because you enjoy the climb. You aim high because falling feels unbearable. Failure doesn't feel like an event. It feels like exposure. As if one mistake would confirm a suspicion you've been trying to outrun your whole life. Another layer deepens. Perfectionism forms early, not because someone demanded excellence, but because love, safety, or approval felt conditional. You learned that being acceptable required performance. Not perfection, but control. Control over how you appeared. Control over how you were judged. Control over how much room you were allowed to take. So you became precise, careful, hyper-aware. Another layer sharpens. Precision kept you safe. Mistakes felt dangerous because mistakes attracted attention. Attention wasn't neutral. It came with criticism, withdrawal, shame, comparison. So you learned to preempt it. Another layer deepens. Perfectionism is preemptive self-defense. You attack yourself before anyone else can. You refine, you correct, you tighten. You call it standards, but standards don't punish you. Perfectionism does. Another layer sharpens. Notice how your inner voice sounds. It's not encouraging. It's urgent, sharp, relentless. It doesn't say, "Let's do this well." It says, "This isn't good enough yet." Yet never ends. Another layer deepens. Perfectionism is future-oriented anxiety. You're not present with what you're doing. You're already imagining the judgment that might follow. How it will be received, what will be noticed, where you might be exposed. So you polish endlessly. Another layer sharpens. This polishing doesn't create safety. It creates fragility. The more perfect something must be, the more devastating imperfection becomes. A small mistake feels huge because the system you built has no tolerance for error. Another layer deepens. This is why perfectionists struggle to finish things. Completion invites evaluation. Evaluation invites judgment. Judgment feels like danger. So you keep refining. Another layer sharpens. Perfectionism is not about doing more. It's about never allowing yourself to be done. Done means stopping. Stopping means being seen without movement to hide behind. Another layer deepens. This is why rest feels uncomfortable. When you rest, there is nothing to justify your worth. No output, no progress, just you. And that feels exposed. Another layer sharpens. So you stay busy. You stay productive. You stay improving. You don't stop because stopping would require you to sit with the fear that maybe you're only valuable when you perform. Another layer deepens. Perfectionism doesn't raise confidence. It erodes it. Because confidence comes from resilience, and resilience requires mistakes. Perfectionism avoids mistakes at all costs. So resilience never forms. Another layer sharpens. You become good, very good, but never secure. Because security doesn't come from flawlessness. It comes from surviving imperfection. Another layer deepens. This is why praise doesn't land. When someone compliments you, you feel relief, not pride. Relief that you weren't exposed this time. That relief fades quickly, because the fear remains. Another layer sharpens. You don't trust positive feedback. You trust criticism. Criticism confirms what you're already monitoring for. Another layer deepens. So you keep scanning yourself for what's wrong. You fix it before anyone else notices. This looks like self-awareness. It's actually self-surveillance. Another layer sharpens. Perfectionism turns your attention inward in a hostile way. You don't observe yourself with curiosity. You inspect yourself for defects. Another layer deepens. That inspection never ends, Because the standard is not real. It's a moving target designed to keep you vigilant. Another layer sharpens. The trap is subtle. Perfectionism promises safety after you get it right, but right is undefined. So safety is postponed indefinitely. Another layer deepens. You tell yourself, once this is done, I'll relax. Then it's done, and you don't relax. You move the goalpost. Another layer sharpens. The problem was never the task. It was the belief that your worth is tied to outcome. Another layer deepens. Perfectionism thrives on comparison. Not loud comparison, internal comparison. An invisible ideal you never quite reach. You're not competing with others. You're competing with a version of yourself that never exists. Another layer sharpens. That imaginary version is always calmer, more disciplined, more accomplished. You chase it relentlessly. Another layer deepens. Chasing it keeps you busy. Busy enough to avoid a deeper fear. The fear that without striving, you might feel empty. Another layer sharpens. Perfectionism fills emptiness with effort. Effort feels meaningful, but it's a substitute. Another layer deepens. This is why perfectionism collapses when you slow down. Without motion, the fear surfaces. Not dramatic, quiet. A sense of, I'm not enough yet. Another layer sharpens. That yet is the leash. It keeps you moving. It keeps you trapped. Another layer deepens. Perfectionism is fear wearing discipline's face. And discipline alone cannot save you from a fear that demands endless proof. Another layer sharpens. Proof never satisfies fear. It only feeds it. Another layer deepens. Until the question changes. Not, how can I be better? But, what am I afraid would happen if I stopped trying to be perfect? Sit with that. Because inside that fear is the real trap. And once you see it clearly, the endless chase begins to lose its grip. Why never enough becomes your permanent baseline. Baseline. The most dangerous thing perfectionism does is not exhaust you. It recalibrates what enough means until the word loses all meaning. You don't fail to reach enough. Enough disappears. Another layer deepens. Early on, effort brought relief. You did well. You were praised. The tension dropped, briefly. Your system learned a pattern. Effort equals safety. So you repeated it, again and again. But the relief never lasted. Not because you did something wrong, because relief was never the goal. Control was. Another layer sharpens. Enough is a stopping point. Stopping feels dangerous to a system trained to survive by vigilance. So your psyche removes the stop sign. There is always something left to fix. Another improvement to make. Another weakness to address. Another standard to raise. Another layer deepens. You don't consciously decide that nothing is ever enough. You feel it as restlessness, a low-grade dissatisfaction that follows every achievement. You finish something, you should feel complete. Instead, you feel exposed. Completion means evaluation. Evaluation means judgment. So instead of landing, you immediately move. Another layer sharpens. This is why perfectionists rarely enjoy success. Success freezes the moment, and frozen moments invite scrutiny. So you unfreeze it by setting a new goal, by raising the bar, by criticizing what you just accomplished. Another layer deepens. You don't allow enough because enough would mean nothing is actively protecting you. No striving, no proving, just you standing still. Another layer sharpens. Standing still feels unsafe because it feels like visibility. Visibility once came with consequences, so you learned to keep moving. Another layer deepens. Over time, never enough becomes internalized, not as a belief, as a felt sense. You walk through life with the quiet conviction that you are always behind, even when you're ahead. Another layer sharpens. This creates chronic urgency. You're never late in real terms, but internally, you always feel late. Late to improve, late to catch up, late to become acceptable. Another layer deepens. That urgency drives productivity, and productivity is rewarded, so the cycle is reinforced. No one tells you to stop. They benefit from your effort. Another layer sharpens. Externally, you look disciplined. Internally, you feel hunted by time, by standards, by an invisible evaluator that never sleeps. Another layer deepens. This is why relaxation feels undeserved. Even during rest, your mind runs audits. You think about what you should be doing. Rest becomes conditional, only allowed after everything is finished. But nothing is ever finished. Another layer sharpens. So rest feels like guilt, not relief. Another layer deepens. Never enough also distorts self-perception. You don't see what you've done. You see what's missing. You don't track growth. You track gaps. Another layer sharpens. This gap focus keeps you motivated, but it also keeps you dissatisfied. You are never allowed to arrive. Another layer deepens. Arrival would mean your value is not dependent on constant improvement. That idea feels destabilizing. Another layer sharpens. So the psyche rejects it. It replaces arrival with endless becoming. Becoming sounds noble, but endless becoming without rest is a prison. Another layer deepens. You may believe that without this pressure, you would become lazy. That fear keeps the trap locked. But laziness is not what waits underneath. What waits underneath is grief. Grief for how long you've been running. Grief for how much you postponed yourself. Another layer sharpens. Never enough keeps grief at bay. As long as you're chasing the next standard, you don't have to feel what the chase has cost you. Another layer deepens. This is why slowing down feels emotional. Not because you're weak, because emotion was deferred in favor of performance. Another layer sharpens. The trap tightens because perfectionism equates slowing with falling behind. So you speed up instead. Another layer deepens. Speed creates distance from your internal state. Distance feels safer. Another layer sharpens. But the cost accumulates. Burnout, numbness, a sense of emptiness even when life looks successful. Another layer deepens. You start asking the wrong question. What else should I do? Instead of the right one. Why does nothing I do feel sufficient? Another layer sharpens. The answer is not more achievement. It's that enough was never allowed to exist. It was erased to keep you vigilant. Another layer deepens. Until you notice this, you will keep chasing a finish line designed to move. Another layer sharpens. And once you notice it, something uncomfortable happens. You feel the fatigue you've been outrunning. You feel the sadness underneath the drive. Another layer deepens. That sadness is not failure. It's information. Information about a system that learned to equate worth with motion. Another layer sharpens. Never enough is not truth. It's a habit. A habit formed to keep you safe in environments where stopping meant losing approval. Another layer deepens. You are not broken for feeling this way. You were trained. Another layer sharpens. And what was trained can be questioned. But questioning it means tolerating the discomfort of not chasing for a moment. Another layer deepens. That pause is terrifying. Because without striving, you don't know who you are yet. Another layer sharpens. But that pause is also the only place where enough can finally land. Not as an achievement, as a permission. Permission to stop running without disappearing. Why perfectionism turns self-improvement into self-rejection. At first, it feels healthy. You're working on yourself, refining habits, fixing weaknesses, becoming better. From the outside, it looks like growth. From the inside, something darker is happening. Every improvement carries a hidden message. You were not acceptable before this. Another layer deepens. Perfectionism doesn't motivate change through curiosity. It motivates through disapproval. You don't improve because you're interested. You improve because staying the same feels dangerous. Another layer sharpens. Self-improvement under perfectionism is not additive. It's subtractive. Each step forward is also a quiet erasure of who you were allowed to be before. Another layer deepens. You don't look back at earlier versions of yourself with compassion. You look back with embarrassment, cringe, judgment. How did I not see that? How was I ever like that? That reaction reveals the core mechanism. Growth has become a weapon. Another layer sharpens. Instead of integrating your past, you disown it. You don't say, "That version of me did the best they could." You say, "That version of me was flawed." And flawlessness is the crime you cannot forgive. Another layer deepens. This creates an endless internal war. Each new standard condemns the previous one. You're never building on yourself. You're constantly replacing yourself. Another layer sharpens. Replacement feels efficient. Integration feels messy. So perfectionism chooses replacement. Another layer deepens. You don't allow gradual development. You demand immediate correction. Mistakes aren't learning moments. They're evidence. Evidence that you're still not there. Another layer sharpens. This turns self-awareness into surveillance. You don't notice patterns to understand them. You notice patterns to eliminate them. Another layer deepens. Even positive traits become targets. If you're confident, you watch for arrogance. If you're disciplined, you watch for rigidity. If you're kind, you watch for weakness. Nothing is safe from inspection. Another layer sharpens. Perfectionism has no loyalty. It eventually attacks everything. Another layer deepens. This is why self-improvement never brings peace. Each gain expands the territory of self-criticism. The more refined you become, the more refined your standards get. Another layer sharpens. You're not trying to become whole. You're trying to become unassailable. And unassailable is not a human state. Another layer deepens. Perfectionism treats the self as a project that must be optimized to avoid rejection, not as a living system that grows through tolerance and repair. Another layer sharpens. This is why compassion feels foreign. Compassion feels like letting something slide. Letting something slide feels dangerous. Dangerous because perfectionism believes any tolerance will lead to collapse. Another layer deepens. So you stay strict, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. Pain becomes proof that you're serious. Another layer sharpens. You mistake discomfort for virtue, suffering for discipline, harshness for honesty. Another layer deepens. But honesty without mercy is just cruelty with good posture. Another layer sharpens. Self-rejection hides inside productivity. You don't say, "I hate myself." You say, "I just need to work harder." Another layer deepens. That sentence is socially acceptable. It's even praised. No one questions it. Another layer sharpens. But listen closely. Harder always implies not good enough yet. Another layer deepens. Perfectionism doesn't allow you to be. It only allows you to become. And becoming never ends. Another layer sharpens. This is why you feel disconnected from your own progress. You don't feel like the same person evolving. You feel like a series of attempts to escape who you were. Another layer deepens. Escaping yourself never works. It only creates fragmentation. Parts of you are always left behind, ignored, ashamed, unintegrated. Another layer sharpens. Those parts don't disappear. They wait. And they resurface as anxiety, imposter syndrome, or sudden collapse. Another layer deepens. Imposter syndrome is not insecurity. It's the consequence of self-rejection. If you never accepted yourself at any stage, why would you trust your current one? Another layer sharpens. Perfectionism keeps you chasing legitimacy. You're always about to be real, almost deserving, almost allowed. Another layer deepens. This almost is torture, because it promises arrival while denying rest. Another layer sharpens. True self-improvement includes tolerance. Tolerance for mistakes. Tolerance for inconsistency. Tolerance for being unfinished. Perfectionism rejects tolerance because tolerance feels like weakness. Another layer deepens. But tolerance is not weakness. It's capacity. Capacity to hold complexity without splitting yourself into acceptable and unacceptable. Another layer sharpens. Without tolerance, growth becomes violent. You force change instead of allowing it. Another layer deepens. Forced change doesn't stick. It creates rebellion, burnout, collapse. Another layer sharpens. Eventually, the system breaks down. Not because you weren't disciplined enough, because discipline was never the missing piece. Another layer deepens. What was missing was permission to be imperfect without consequence. Another layer sharpens. Perfectionism promises safety through improvement. But improvement without acceptance never delivers safety. It only delivers exhaustion. Another layer deepens. You don't need to stop growing. You need to stop using growth as evidence against yourself. Another layer sharpens. Growth can be an expression of curiosity, or it can be an escape from shame. The outcome looks similar. The internal cost is not. Another layer deepens. Until you notice how often your drive is fueled by self-rejection, you will keep mistaking pressure for purpose. Another layer sharpens. And once you notice it, the work changes. Not immediately, but fundamentally. Another layer deepens. You start asking a different question. Not, how can I fix myself? But, what part of me am I trying to outrun? That question doesn't push you forward. It slows you down. And slowing down is where the trap begins to loosen. Because perfectionism cannot survive where curiosity replaces judgment. Why perfectionism keeps you forever in the future. Perfectionism is never satisfied with now. It survives by postponement. Not loudly, not obviously, quietly. You tell yourself relief is coming, just not yet. After this project, after this improvement, after this version of you finally replaces the last one. Another layer deepens. Perfectionism relocates your life into the future. You are always about to arrive, almost ready, almost deserving, almost allowed to relax, almost never ends. Another layer sharpens. You live in anticipation, not presence. Your body is here. Your attention is not. It's evaluating outcomes that haven't happened yet, judgment that hasn't arrived yet, standards that haven't been met yet. Another layer deepens. This creates a subtle dissociation. You move through days efficiently without actually inhabiting them. Moments blur. Achievements register intellectually, not emotionally. Because emotional presence was postponed. Another layer sharpens. Presence feels indulgent to a perfectionist. Dangerous. Presence has no utility. It doesn't improve anything. It doesn't fix anything. So it feels suspicious. Another layer deepens. Perfectionism believes time must be used. If you're not improving, optimizing, or preparing, you're wasting it. So even joy becomes strategic, a reward, something earned later. Another layer sharpens. This turns life into a holding pattern. You're always preparing to live, never living. Another layer deepens. You might not notice this directly. You notice it as impatience, a constant internal pressure to move on, even during good moments, even during rest. Another layer sharpens. You struggle to savor anything. As soon as something is good, your mind asks, what's next? What could be better? How long will this last? Another layer deepens. Perfectionism cannot tolerate finality. Finality means stopping evaluation. Stopping evaluation means vulnerability. So it keeps everything provisional, temporary, conditional. Another layer sharpens. You don't say, this is enough. You say, this is fine for now. Fine for now is perfectionism's favorite phrase. Another layer deepens. It keeps the door open for future correction. Another layer sharpens. This future orientation also protects you from disappointment. If you never fully arrive, you never fully lose. Another layer deepens. Hope becomes safer than fulfillment. Hope can't be taken away. Fulfillment can. Another layer sharpens. So you stay in hope. Hope of becoming better. Hope of being ready. Hope of finally relaxing. Another layer deepens. This hope is not optimism. It's avoidance. Avoidance of standing still and feeling what's here. Another layer sharpens. What's here might include fatigue, grief, anger, loneliness. Perfectionism keeps you moving so you don't have to feel them. Another layer deepens. Busyness becomes emotional anesthesia. Another layer sharpens. This is why slowing down feels threatening. Not boring, threatening. Because without the future to escape into, you're left with the present. And the present contains everything you've postponed feeling. Another layer deepens. Perfectionism keeps you safe from disappointment by never letting you fully commit to now. If nothing is complete, nothing can truly fail. Another layer sharpens. But nothing can truly satisfy either. Another layer deepens. This creates a low-grade emptiness. Not despair, not depression, a subtle flatness. Life feels thin, like you're touching it through glass. Another layer sharpens. You tell yourself it will feel real later, when you're better, more accomplished, more stable. Another layer deepens. Later becomes a mirage, always visible, never reachable. Another layer sharpens. Perfectionism keeps redefining readiness. You're never ready enough to rest, never ready enough to enjoy, never ready enough to stop. Another layer deepens. Stopping feels like falling behind an invisible race, a race no one else is running. Another layer sharpens. This future fixation also erodes identity. You don't know who you are, only who you're trying to become. Your sense of self is always provisional, temporary, incomplete. Another layer deepens. You don't inhabit yourself, you manage yourself. Another layer sharpens. Management replaces presence. Checklists replace intuition. Metrics replace feeling. Another layer deepens. This works in systems. It fails in human life. Another layer sharpens. You cannot spreadsheet meaning. You cannot optimize fulfillment. You cannot future plan enough to feel alive. Another layer deepens. Perfectionism promises a moment when you'll finally arrive. That moment never comes, because arrival requires permission, and perfectionism never grants it. Another layer sharpens. You don't need more time. You need to reclaim time from a future that keeps stealing your present. Another layer deepens. This doesn't mean you abandon goals. It means you stop postponing life until goals are achieved. Another layer sharpens. You stop treating now as a rehearsal. Another layer deepens. You don't wait to be finished to be here. Another layer sharpens. Presence doesn't require perfection. It requires courage. The courage to exist without being optimized. Another layer deepens. This is uncomfortable at first, because you lose the buffer of becoming. You're here, as you are, without edits. Another layer sharpens. But something unexpected happens. The pressure eases. Not all at once, but enough. Enough to breathe. Another layer deepens. When you stop living in the future, never enough loses its fuel, because never only exists when now is denied. Another layer sharpens. And once now is allowed, even imperfectly, perfectionism begins to starve, because it cannot survive where life is being lived instead of postponed. Why perfectionism destroys your ability to feel alive and a children. Why perfectionism destroys your name where life is never forgot. Why perfectionism destroys your major and starve where live. Because it cannot survive where life is being lived. Because it cannot survive where life is being lived. Why perfectionism destroys your major. Perfectionism. Why perfectionism destroys your major. Then it is real hired, because never is alive. Another layer deepens. When you still breathe with a yellow managed member is when forever, before your ability to feel alive. Perfectionism doesn't numb you when they do released. Perfectionism designed waiting to alive and they lived to feel alive. Perfectionism doesn't numb you when they feel alive and live to feel. Perfectionism doesn't numb you when they stop you when they feel alive. Perfectionism doesn't numb you when they feel alive and live to feel. Perfectionism doesn't numb you when they feel alive and live to feel. Perfectionism doesn't numb you when they feel alive and live to feel. Perfectionism doesn't numb you when they feel alive and live to feel. Perfectionism doesn't numb you all at once. It drains you gradually. So gradually, you don't notice what's disappearing. You still function. You still achieve. You still move forward. But something essential fades. Vitality. Another layer deepens. Feeling alive requires permission. Permission to feel without evaluating. Permission to act without optimizing. Permission to experience without extracting value. Perfectionism revokes that permission. It places a filter between you and life. Nothing is felt directly. Everything is assessed. Another layer sharpens. You don't experience moments. You monitor them. You ask silently, is this productive? Is this worth my time? Am I doing this well enough? Those questions kill aliveness. Not dramatically, quietly. Another layer deepens. Aliveness is spontaneous. It doesn't wait for readiness. It doesn't require completion. It appears in moments of immersion. Moments where you forget to watch yourself. Perfectionism never forgets. Another layer sharpens. It keeps a part of you outside the experience, grading it in real time. That grading creates distance. Distance blocks sensation. Another layer deepens. This is why perfectionists often feel emotionally muted. Not depressed, muted. Colors are there, but slightly faded. Joy registers intellectually, not somatically. Another layer sharpens. You know something is good. You don't feel it fully. Another layer deepens. That fullness requires letting go of control. And control is the one thing perfectionism refuses to release. Another layer sharpens. Control feels necessary because letting go once led to pain. So you stay alert, even in pleasure, especially in pleasure. Another layer deepens. Pleasure makes you vulnerable. Vulnerable to loss. Vulnerable to disappointment. So you don't sink into it, you hover above it. Another layer sharpens. Hovering feels safe. It also feels empty. Another layer deepens. Perfectionism replaces sensation with satisfaction. Satisfaction is cognitive. I did this right. I earned this. I checked the box. Sensation is bodily. Warmth, excitement, ease. Perfectionism prefers satisfaction. Satisfaction doesn't require surrender. Another layer sharpens. Over time, your nervous system forgets how to drop into sensation. You become good at restraint, bad at immersion. Another layer deepens. This affects everything. Work feels endless. Rest feels unearned. Relationships feel measured. Joy feels brief. Another layer sharpens. You may think the problem is stress. It isn't. It's distance from experience. Another layer deepens. You don't feel alive because you're never fully here. Part of you is always managing. Another layer sharpens. Managing keeps you safe. It also keeps you separate. Another layer deepens. Life happens in contact. Contact with emotion. Contact with uncertainty. Contact with imperfection. Perfectionism reduces contact. It keeps life at arm's length. Another layer sharpens. This is why excitement feels dangerous. Excitement lowers vigilance, so you dampen it. You call it maturity. Another layer deepens. But maturity is not numbness. It's capacity. Capacity to feel without losing yourself. Perfectionism confuses the two. Another layer sharpens. You don't trust feeling alive. You trust being controlled. Another layer deepens. Controlled states feel predictable. Aliveness is unpredictable. Unpredictability once cost you something, so your system learned to avoid it. Another layer sharpens. The tragedy is not that you're unhappy, it's that you're unmoved. Another layer deepens. Unmoved feels stable. It also feels hollow. Another layer sharpens. You may chase stimulation to compensate. Productivity, achievement, intensity. None of it restores aliveness. Because aliveness doesn't come from doing more, it comes from allowing more. Another layer deepens. Allowing means tolerating mess, imperfection, unfinished moments. Another layer sharpens. Perfectionism cannot allow these states, so it starves the very thing it's trying to protect. Another layer deepens. You wanted safety. You traded vitality for it. And the trade was never explicit. It happened slowly, one correction at a time, one withheld impulse at a time. Another layer sharpens. You didn't choose numbness. You chose control. Numbness was the side effect. Another layer deepens. Feeling alive again doesn't require becoming reckless. It requires loosening the grip, moment by moment, allowing sensation without immediately shaping it. Another layer sharpens. This feels uncomfortable because you're not used to raw experience. Another layer deepens. But discomfort is not danger. It's unfamiliarity. Another layer sharpens. The first signs of aliveness often feel strange. Restlessness, emotion, desire. You may interpret them as problems. They are signals. Another layer deepens. Signals that life is trying to move again. Another layer sharpens. Perfectionism will tell you to manage them, to refine them, to make them acceptable. Resist that impulse. Another layer deepens. Aliveness cannot be perfected. It can only be felt. Another layer sharpens. Feeling requires courage, not to improve, to experience. Another layer deepens. When you allow experience without immediately correcting it, something returns. Not ecstasy, presence. Presence is quieter, but it's real. Another layer sharpens. Presence is the opposite of the trap, because in presence, nothing needs to be enough. It simply is. Another layer deepens. And where life is allowed to be, perfectionism has no leverage, because you're no longer chasing aliveness. You're inhabiting it. Why perfectionism is built on conditional worth. Perfectionism is not really about standards. It's about permission to exist. Somewhere early, you learned a quiet rule. You are acceptable if you perform well, if you don't disappoint, if you don't cause problems, if you stay impressive, useful, controlled. That if never left. It just evolved. Another layer deepens. Conditional worth does not feel like worthlessness. It feels like pressure. Pressure to maintain. Pressure to prove. Pressure to never drop below the line. The line is invisible, but you feel it constantly. Another layer sharpens. Perfectionism grows out of environments where love, attention, or safety were inconsistent. Not absent, inconsistent. Sometimes warmth, sometimes withdrawal. Sometimes approval, sometimes criticism. Your nervous system adapted. It tried to stabilize the environment by stabilizing you. Another layer deepens. You learned that being precise reduced unpredictability, that being excellent reduced risk, that being flawless kept you safe. So you internalized the rule. If I'm perfect, nothing can be taken away. Another layer sharpens. But perfection never secures unconditional acceptance. It only delays rejection. That delay feels like safety, until it doesn't. Another layer deepens. Conditional worth is exhausting because it requires constant vigilance. You're never just existing, you're qualifying. Every interaction becomes an evaluation. Every outcome becomes evidence. Another layer sharpens. You don't ask, how do I feel about this? You ask, how does this reflect on me? That shift disconnects you from yourself. Another layer deepens. Self-worth becomes externalized. It depends on performance metrics, feedback, outcomes, recognition. When those are present, you feel temporarily solid. When they disappear, you feel hollow. Another layer sharpens. This volatility is not confidence. It's dependency. Another layer deepens. Perfectionism tries to solve dependency by increasing control. But control increases fragility. Because when worth is conditional, mistakes feel catastrophic. Another layer sharpens. A single error feels like identity collapse. Not because it matters objectively, because it threatens your right to exist comfortably. Another layer deepens. This is why perfectionists often overreact internally. Small failures feel massive because they hit the foundation. Another layer sharpens. You're not upset about the mistake. You're afraid of what the mistake means. Another layer deepens. It means you're human, and humanity feels unsafe when worth was never guaranteed. Another layer sharpens. So you double down. You tighten standards. You raise expectations. You become more rigid. Another layer deepens. Rigidity is a defense. It creates predictability, but it also creates brittleness. Another layer sharpens. Brittle systems break. Flexible systems endure. Perfectionism chooses brittleness because flexibility feels like risk. Another layer deepens. Conditional worth also distorts relationships. You don't feel lovable. You feel valuable. Value must be maintained. So you perform even in intimacy. You manage impressions. You avoid showing weakness. Another layer sharpens. This keeps you admired, but not known. Another layer deepens. Being known requires unconditional presence. Perfectionism forbids that, because unconditional presence means you might still be accepted even when imperfect. That idea destabilizes the entire system. Another layer sharpens. If worth is unconditional, perfectionism loses its purpose, so it resists. Another layer deepens. You may intellectually believe you are worthy as you are, but your nervous system doesn't. It learned worth through contingency, so it enforces the old rule. Another layer sharpens. This is why affirmations don't work. You can't talk a nervous system out of a contract it signed through experience. Another layer deepens. The contract says, stay sharp, stay acceptable. Breaking that contract feels dangerous. Another layer sharpens. So healing perfectionism is not about lowering standards. It's about dissolving the condition that says your worth must be earned. Another layer deepens. This does not happen through self-talk. It happens through behavioral disobedience, resting without earning it, stopping without justification, allowing mistakes without self-punishment. These acts feel wrong at first because they violate the contract. Another layer sharpens. Your body reacts with anxiety, guilt, urgency. That reaction is not truth. It's withdrawal from an addiction. Another layer deepens. The addiction is to conditional safety. Perfectionism provided structure, even if it hurt. Another layer sharpens. Letting go feels like freefall, but it's not freefall. It's ground you never trusted. Another layer deepens. Unconditional worth is not a belief. It's a felt permission. Permission to exist without proving. That permission feels foreign, almost illegal. Another layer sharpens. But over time, as you survive moments of imperfection without collapse or abandonment, your system updates. Another layer deepens. It learns something new, that you can be flawed and still intact, that you can disappoint and still be safe, that nothing catastrophic happens when you stop qualifying. Another layer sharpens. This learning is slow, but it's real. Another layer deepens, and as conditional worth loosens, perfectionism loses its grip, because there is nothing left to protect. Another layer sharpens. You no longer need to be flawless to feel allowed. You are allowed first. Everything else becomes optional. Another layer deepens. Now that you see why perfectionism is built on conditional worth, what condition are you still trying to meet to feel safe in your own life? And what would happen if you violated that condition gently, just once, and discovered you still existed afterward? Why letting go of perfection feels like losing control? The fear is not subtle. When you imagine loosening your standards, your body reacts immediately. A tightening, a spike of urgency, a sense that something bad will happen if you stop holding everything together. That reaction tells the truth. Perfectionism is not just a habit, it is a control system. Another layer deepens. Control was never about dominance. It was about predictability. If you could control yourself well enough, maybe the world wouldn't turn on you. Maybe disappointment could be avoided. Maybe rejection could be preempted. Maybe chaos could be kept at bay. Perfectionism promised order, and order felt like safety. Another layer sharpens. So when you consider letting it go, your nervous system interprets that as threat, not freedom, threat. Because control once stood between you and harm. Another layer deepens. You don't fear imperfection. You fear what imperfection will unleash. Judgment, loss of respect, loss of belonging, loss of identity. Another layer sharpens. Perfectionism held these fears at a distance, barely, but enough. Another layer deepens. This is why letting go doesn't feel like relief at first. It feels like collapse, as if everything you worked to prevent might rush in all at once. Another layer sharpens. You imagine becoming careless, lazy, unrecognizable. You imagine falling behind and never catching up. Another layer deepens. These images are not predictions. They are withdrawal symptoms. Your system is reacting to the removal of its primary regulator. Another layer sharpens. Perfectionism regulated anxiety, not eliminated it. Regulated it by keeping you busy. Busy enough to avoid deeper fears. Another layer deepens. When you stop tightening control, those fears surface. Not because letting go causes them, because perfectionism kept them suppressed. Another layer sharpens. This is why many people relapse into perfectionism after trying to relax. The anxiety spikes. They mistake that spike as proof that control is necessary. Another layer deepens. It isn't proof. It's exposure. Exposure to feelings that were deferred. Another layer sharpens. Letting go of perfection means allowing uncertainty. And uncertainty is what your system has been trying to eliminate your entire life. Another layer deepens. Control made life predictable. Predictability felt safer than authenticity. Another layer sharpens. So you chose control, again and again, even when it hurt. Another layer deepens. Letting go now feels like betraying the part of you that survived. That part worked hard. It kept you functioning. It kept you respected. It kept you ahead. Another layer sharpens. You don't want to abandon it. And you don't have to. Letting go is not destruction. It's reassignment. Another layer deepens. The control that once managed worth can be redirected toward boundaries, toward pacing, toward discernment. Control does not disappear. It changes role. Another layer sharpens. Instead of controlling yourself, you control what you accept. Instead of controlling outcomes, you control exposure. Instead of controlling perception, you control alignment. Another layer deepens. This shift feels disorienting because it's internal authority instead of internal surveillance. Another layer sharpens. Surveillance feels active. Authority feels quiet. Quiet can feel empty at first. Another layer deepens. You're used to pressure. Silence feels like something's wrong. Another layer sharpens. Nothing is wrong. You're just no longer being driven by fear disguised as discipline. Another layer deepens. Letting go also forces you to confront grief. Grief for how long you lived under self-imposed pressure. Grief for how much of yourself you postponed. Another layer sharpens. Perfectionism kept you from feeling that grief, because grief might slow you down. Another layer deepens. Slowing down was never allowed. Another layer sharpens. So the fear of letting go is also fear of feeling. Feeling sadness, anger, disappointment. These emotions were inconvenient, so you optimized past them. Another layer deepens. Letting go brings them back, not to punish you, to be processed. Another layer sharpens. This is why loosening perfection often feels heavier before it feels lighter. You're carrying what you deferred. Another layer deepens. The paradox is this: control feels strong, but it's fragile because it requires constant effort. Letting go feels weak, but it's durable because it doesn't depend on constant correction. Another layer sharpens. You don't become passive when you release perfectionism. You become responsive. Responsive to reality, not to fear projections. Another layer deepens. You still care. You still act. But you no longer believe everything depends on getting it exactly right. Another layer sharpens. That belief was the trap. Another layer deepens. The world does not collapse when you stop tightening. People don't abandon you en masse. Your life doesn't unravel. What unravels is the illusion that perfection was holding everything together. Another layer sharpens. You discover something unsettling and relieving, that much of the pressure was never required. Another layer deepens. You were carrying it alone. Another layer sharpens. Letting go feels like losing control, because control became your identity. Without it, you don't know who you are. Yet, another layer deepens. That not knowing is not failure, it's openness. Another layer sharpens. Perfectionism told you who you had to be. Letting go lets you discover who you are without threat. Another layer deepens. Discovery is slower than optimization, but it's real. Another layer sharpens. And once you experience life without constant internal policing, the fear of letting go begins to dissolve. Not because control disappears, because trust appears. Trust in your ability to respond rather than manage. Another layer deepens. You don't need perfection to stay intact. You never did. Another layer sharpens. Now that you see why letting go of perfection feels like losing control, what part of your life are you still gripping tightly because you believe releasing it would cause everything else to fall apart? And what might you discover if you loosened that grip just enough to see what actually happens? when enough finally becomes real. The shift doesn't announce itself. There's no moment where you declare freedom from perfection, no dramatic release, no sudden peace. What changes is quieter. You stop tightening. Not everywhere, not all at once, just enough to notice how much tension you were carrying for no one but yourself. You realize something unsettling. Nothing collapses. The world doesn't punish you for not being optimal. People don't disappear because you showed up unfinished. Opportunities don't evaporate because you allowed yourself to be human. That realization lands slowly, and when it does, it rewrites the rules you've lived by. You see it clearly now. Perfection was never protecting you. It was postponing your life. You weren't disciplined. You were braced. You weren't driven. You were avoiding stillness. Stillness felt dangerous because stillness meant no justification, no improvement narrative, no forward motion to hide behind. Just you. And that was the thing you were never taught was enough. So you kept becoming, and becoming, and becoming. Now, something ends. Not ambition, not growth. The threat underneath them. You stop using improvement as evidence of worth. You still refine, but you no longer punish. You still care, but you no longer equate mistakes with exposure. You don't abandon standards. You abandon the belief that standards determine your right to exist comfortably. That belief was the cage. Once it loosens, your nervous system begins to rest. Not constantly, but more often. You notice it in small ways. You finish things without reopening them. You rest, without explaining why you earned it. You feel satisfaction without immediately undermining it. These moments feel unfamiliar, almost suspicious, but they're real. You're not losing your edge. You're losing fear. Fear was loud. Fear was motivating. Fear kept you sharp. But fear also kept you fragmented, always preparing, never landing. Now you land, briefly at first, then longer. And when you land, you feel something you mistook for laziness. It's presence. Presence doesn't push. It doesn't rush. It doesn't prove. It allows. You don't feel invincible. You feel solid. Solid enough to make mistakes without self-erasure. Solid enough to be seen without armor. Solid enough to stop chasing an imaginary version of yourself who never needed to exist. You no longer ask, "Am I good enough yet?" You ask, "Am I here?" And being here is enough. Not forever, not perfectly. Enough for this moment. Enough to breathe without earning it. Enough to live without qualifying. Enough to let your life happen without constantly correcting it. That's the irreversible change. You don't stop improving. You stop needing improvement to justify your place in the world. And standing here now, with your standards intact, but your worth no longer on trial, what part of your life are you finally ready to live without waiting to be better first?